Witnesses on the ground said it looked like a comet, a supersonic airliner climbing out of Paris, trailing a plume of fire longer than the aircraft itself. People stopped their cars, they pointed at the sky, some of them filmed it, and in that moment, the dream of supersonic travel became a disaster unfolding in plain sight on TV. Inside, 109 people had no idea what was happening beneath them. The crew knew. They had already lost one engine, then a second. The aircraft was hemorrhaging fuel, the fire was growing, and the plane, the most celebrated aircraft ever built, was no longer flying so much as it was falling. They were at 200 feet when it became unsurvivable. The Concorde had crossed the Atlantic in 3 hours. It had carried kings and presidents and celebrities at twice the speed of sound for 27 years. It was the symbol of everything aviation could be when engineers refused to accept limits. And it was brought down by a strip of metal the size of a ruler that fell off another plane, a component worth less than $30. To understand why this crash hit the world so hard, you need to understand what the Concorde actually was. It first flew in 1969, it entered passenger service in 1976, and from the moment it crossed the Atlantic, it operated in a category entirely its own, cruising at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, over 60,000 feet of altitude, London to New York in 3.5 hours, while every other aircraft needed 7. The passengers who flew it weren't just buying a seat, they were buying time, celebrities, CEOs, heads of state, the kind of people for whom 3 hours saved was worth thousands of dollars spent. But the Concorde was more than a status symbol. It was an engineering achievement that had never been replicated. Its fuselage stretched several inches in flight from the heat of supersonic travel. Its nose drooped on approach so pilots could see the runway. It burned more fuel per passenger than almost any aircraft before or since, and no one cared, because nothing else could do what it did. By the summer of 2000, it had flown for 27 years without a single passenger fatality. That record was about to end. 27 years of perfection, and it would take less than 72 seconds to erase all of it. July 25th, 2000. Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, Air France, Flight 4590 is preparing for departure. The destination is New York. On board are 100 passengers, mostly German tourists heading for a cruise, and 9 crew members. The aircraft is fueled, checked, and cleared. But earlier that afternoon, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had departed the same runway, and as it climbed out, a titanium wear strip fell from one of its engine thrust reversers and came to rest on the runway surface. It was small, roughly 43 centimeters long, a few centimeters wide. Titanium, so hard, rigid, unyielding. Nobody saw it fall, nobody cleared it, and as the Concorde accelerated down that same runway at over 300 kilometers per hour, its left main landing gear rolled directly over it. What happened next took less than a second. The strip punched into one of the Concorde's tires with enormous force. The tire didn't just deflate, it exploded. A chunk of rubber weighing nearly 4.5 kilograms was flung upward at extreme velocity. It struck the underside of the wing, not the fuel tank itself, but close enough. The shockwave from the impact created a pressure wave inside the tank so powerful that it ruptured the structure from the inside out. Fuel began pouring from the wing. The Concorde was already past the speed at which it could safely stop on the runway. The crew had 2 choices: abort and almost certainly crash off the end of the pavement, or rotate and hope the aircraft could climb. They rotated. At the moment the nose lifted, a witness on the ground captured what became one of the most iconic and haunting images in aviation history. The Concorde, climbing away from the runway with a river of flame pouring from beneath its left wing. The fire had ignited almost immediately as fuel met the heat of the engines. In the cockpit, the crew was managing a deteriorating situation in real time. Engine number 2, closest to the fire, surged and failed. Engine number 1 was producing reduced thrust. The aircraft was heavy, slow, and barely climbing. Air traffic control confirmed what the crew could already see on their instruments. Concorde 0, you have flames behind you. The crew declared an emergency and began working through their options. The nearest suitable airport was Le Bourget, just a few miles away. If they could reach it, if the aircraft held together long enough, there was a chance. But the fire was growing, and the aircraft was fighting physics it could not win. Engine number 2 failed completely. Engine number 1 began losing power. Without thrust, the Concorde, already slow and heavy, began to lose airspeed, and an aircraft without airspeed cannot generate lift. The nose began to pitch up as the crew fought to maintain altitude, but pitching up without sufficient speed doesn't save an aircraft. It bleeds the remaining airspeed faster. The Concorde rolled left. At 200 feet above the ground, with the wings no longer generating enough lift to sustain flight, the aircraft became unrecoverable. It struck the ground near the village of Gonesse, 9 kilometers from the runway it had left 72 seconds earlier. The impact obliterated the aircraft and started a fire that burned for hours. The Concorde came down directly on top of a small hotel. 4 people on the ground were also killed. 109 people on board. None survived. 72 seconds from takeoff to impact. The investigation that followed was methodical and in some ways deeply uncomfortable. Because the Concorde itself had not failed. Its engines had not spontaneously malfunctioned. Its structure had not cracked from age or metal fatigue. It had been destroyed by a chain of events that began with a piece of metal that didn't belong to it, a titanium strip that fell from a Continental Airlines aircraft and was never recovered from the runway before the Concorde used it. The French investigation found multiple contributing factors. The titanium strip from the Continental DC-10 was the trigger, but investigators also found that the Concorde's fuel tanks had no lining capable of resisting a rupture from external impact. Other aircraft had such liners. The Concorde did not. They found that the tires, under the extreme loads of a supersonic takeoff, were vulnerable to this kind of catastrophic blowout in a way that had been documented before. There had been previous tire failures on Concordes, some serious, though none had yet caused a crash. They found that the spacer on the Concorde's own landing gear had been installed incorrectly during recent maintenance, a separate issue that may have altered how the landing gear interacted with the runway surface. Each finding pointed to the same conclusion. This was not one failure, it was several, converging at the worst possible moment. The Concorde fleet was grounded immediately following the crash. For 16 months, the most famous aircraft in history sat idle while engineers worked to address the vulnerabilities the investigation had exposed. Kevlar liners were added to the fuel tanks, the same material used in bulletproof vests, to contain ruptures from tire debris. New, more robust tires were fitted. Electrical systems near the fuel tanks were redesigned. In November 2001, the Concorde returned to service. But something had changed. Not in the aircraft, in the world around it. The September 11th attacks had devastated transatlantic travel. The business passengers who filled the Concorde's cabin were flying less. The economics of the aircraft, already marginal, had become impossible to justify. In April 2003, Air France and British Airways announced that the Concorde would be retired. The final commercial flights took place in October of that year. An era ended, not with a grand farewell, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the numbers no longer worked. 1. The passengers never came back. The world had moved on, and the Concorde had nowhere left to fly. The crash of Flight 4590 didn't kill the Concorde on its own, but it cracked something that never fully healed. One strip of titanium, fallen from another aircraft, lying on a runway no one had checked, worth less than $30. It ruptured a fuel tank. It started a fire. It brought down an aircraft that had crossed the Atlantic thousands of times without losing a single passenger. And it ended the only chapter in aviation history where humans flew faster than sound, in comfort, as a matter of routine. Near Gonesse, a memorial stands for the 113 people who died that day. A reminder that in aviation, the distance between routine and catastrophe is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it is razor thin, titanium small, and entirely invisible until it is already too late.